Hi, Dave Sievertson here with Cincinnati General Insurance, speaking briefly about auto insurance. Your personal automobile represents the single largest possible source of catastrophic lawsuits and legal judgments against you for major injuries, death, and property damage. In one split second, your life can change forever, ripped apart by lawsuits, death, debilitating injuries, astronomical medical expenses, and more. In my opinion, the two most important coverages in your auto policy are liability coverage, also known as bodily injury, and uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage. The two most common auto liability coverage mistakes that we see are one, buying far too little coverage, not realizing the substantial amount of money involved in death or injury suits, both in the cost of the judgment and the cost to defend the case. If you Google auto accident lawsuit awards, you'll get an idea of how astronomical some of these judgments can be. One firm that I came across had over $1 billion they'd collected on behalf of their clients. The second mistake is buying inconsistent limits of liability coverage. For instance, people have $100,000 of coverage for their automobile. They have $300,000 of coverage on their home. They may have $50,000 of liability coverage on their boat. The idea is, since you're protecting the same monetary assets, the same income, you want the same liability limits on all your policies. Many people carry bodily injury limits of $100,000 per person, $300,000 per accident on their car. So let's assume that you have those limits, and I'll give you an example. You're running late for work, the light's yellow, you think you can make it. All of a sudden, light turns red, you lock up your brakes, but it's not in time. So you run into my car. I'm also driving on my way to work. You broadside me in the driver's door. I'm taken to the hospital with 2 broken legs. Okay? So what's your liability? Well, first of all, we have medical expenses. Compound fractures, 2 broken legs could easily be $30,000 or $40,000 in medical expenses. Also, I'm going to get compensated for pain and suffering, which could be 2 or 3 times that amount of money. So 3 times 40,000 is $120,000. Also, I'm not going to go to work for maybe the next 3 months. Work on a second floor building with no elevator. So I'm going to be compensated for my time off of work, my lost wages. So maybe that's $30,000. Now, in this case, you're lucky you didn't hit a physician. In that case, it may be $100,000 or $150,000 for that time off of work. Okay, now my wife is going to take time off of work to drive me to my medical appointments. I'm going to hire somebody to mow my lawn. So we put in another $10,000 for those miscellaneous expenses. Now we have a grand total of $200,000. Now that's a big number, but can you imagine how much bigger that number would be if you'd killed me or if I was permanently disabled? So the judgment's $200,000, but our limits are split limits, meaning you have $100,000 per person, $300,000 per accident, which means that your insurance company is only going to pay out $100,000. So where's that other $100,000 going to come from? Well, that's going to be your responsibility. Now, additionally, once the insurance company has paid out $100,000, you're not only going to be responsible for any additional judgment, but you're going to be responsible for your own legal defense. Once the insurance company has paid out their limit, they don't have a dog in the fight anymore, and legal defenses could easily add tens of thousands of dollars to the policy, to the judgment. So what can you do? Since the vast majority of accidents we see are vehicles that are occupied by only one person, and if you think about it, when you drive to work, you've got one person per vehicle most of the time, we recommend 3 strategies. One is if you're going to have split limits of liability, meaning a separate per person limit and a separate per accident limit, then you'd want a minimum limit of $250,000 to $500,000 per person. Okay? In the example that I gave you, that would be enough to cover the cost of the $200,000 that I was going to receive. Now, the cost on your insurance policy between a $100,000, $300,000 limit and a $250,000/$500,000 limit is probably under $100 per year. And typically you can pay for that if you're willing to carry a little bit higher deductible on your collision coverage. Strategy number 2 would be to carry what we call a combined single limit of $500,000 or higher. And that means that for bodily injury, whether it's property damage, whether it's per person, per accident, we're going to have $500,000 to cover us for this accident that we're involved in. The third strategy would be to layer a second layer of coverage on top of our auto policy. Now that layer is called an umbrella policy, personal umbrella policy. So they start at $1 million and go up. So we're going to have our underlying coverage on our auto policy. On top of that, we're going to add $1 million or higher of liability coverage that if we get into those numbers. Now the thing you want to remember with your umbrella policy is you want to have one that also includes uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage protects you and your family from damage by an uninsured or low-limit insured driver. For instance, let's take that same accident I spoke about earlier, but this time I ran into you. Okay, I was late for work, I ran the red light, I've crashed into you. Okay, I've caused you medical injury, lost wages, all the things we saw in the earlier example. But the key is I don't have insurance. I'm driving around without insurance. I don't have any financial assets. So how are you going to get compensated for that? So with the uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage, you're going to be able to collect that from your own insurance company. Estimates are in Ohio that as many as 1 out of 6 drivers are driving without insurance. And that's why that coverage is so important. 2 recommendations we have for uninsured, underinsured motorists. You want to have the same limits as you do on your bodily injury liability portion. You want to protect yourself and your family as well as you're protecting the people that you may crash into for medical injuries, pain and suffering, lost wages, all those things we talked about. A second recommendation is if you do have an umbrella policy, have an umbrella policy that includes that coverage for uninsured, underinsured motorists. I mean, let's say you're in an accident, you have a head injury, you're not going back to work. Okay, disability insurance typically at the best is going to pay 60% of your wages, not any additional income that you have. So where can you get that income from? Okay, so make sure that has that coverage in your umbrella policy, and be careful because many companies don't offer it. You can get a separate standalone policy. You can switch insurance companies, lots of different strategies. Finally, for additional reading, this is my favorite book, Insurance for Dummies. It's where many ideas for any of my thinking on insurance has come by. So I hope that's helpful, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video.